Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Interdisciplinary and Trans-Disciplinary Studies, SOITS, Master of Arts, MA in Folklore and Culture Studies, MAFCS. Second year, MFC 007 Theories and Pedagogy of Folklore. Block-1 Polygenetic Theories of Folklore. Unit-1 Concepts, Evolution and Devolution of Folklore, 1.0 Objectives. After reading this unit, you will be able to learn about the birth and growth of the discipline called folkloristics, i.e., folklore study, during the last 2 centuries with reference to the changes within the discipline. Learn whether folklore will die over time with the advancement of human civilization and with the gradual annihilation of aboriginal societies. Understand that the discipline is going through a process of metamorphosis to make itself relevant for new knowledge-based societies, and visualize how the new generation of folklore scholars can make worthy contributions to diverse applied, descriptive, and theoretical fields in this discipline and other allied ones. 1.1 Introduction. When we examine the evolution of folklore as a subject of interest and an academic discipline, it becomes critical for us to examine the evolution of folklore from a romantic sentiment towards the national culture, to the creation of a strong national identity, to the collection and examination of the origin of ballads and the interaction of these ballads across various cultures. This unit is important to study as it will help us understand not only how the discipline came into existence and the various schools of thought in this discipline, but also to critically examine the shift in the matrix of studying this discipline from a simple recounting of the origin of ballads and what it takes to now belong to a large industrialized global world. This will help us as future folklorists to understand how important the study becomes and how pivotal it is to create the genres as a part of the living tradition. It will also help us negate our own stereotypes that folklore belongs to the common or subaltern and determine that it is very much a part of the highly educated and literate societies. As Thompson remarked in 1949, the study for folklore as for other subjects, this is a continuing and will never end. 1.2 Evolution of Folklore. 1.2.1 Origin of the term folklore. The term folklore was first coined by British antiquarian William John Thoms, 1803 to 1885. He first used the term in 1846 to describe the manners, customs, observances, superstitions, ballads, proverbs, and other materials of older British societies. Thoms was inspired to construct this concept based on the ideas of Grimm brothers, Jacob Carl Grimm, 1785 to 1863, and Wilhelm Carl Grimm, 1786 to 1859, who used the German term Volkskunde, 1806, that refers to the study of customs, beliefs, stories, traditions, etc., of peoples or speech communities. The term folklore, therefore, is a translation of the German term with adequate conceptual and theoretical equivalence. Although the term appeared to be new among the people at that time, the concept it referred to was not novel. For ages, there had been a growing interest in looking into the life and culture of rural and rustic people across the European continent. The European rulers and the aristocratic families had a long practice of collecting items, artifacts and relics of their old traditions and ancestral heritage, which they used to glorify themselves and give validation to their political activities. The religious figures and spokespersons, on the other hand, were collecting these materials to weed the people out from their native culture and societies. They did so, as they believed that these folk materials contained some ominous beliefs and practices that could harm their own belief structures and their religious activities. In the early 19th century, during the spread of Romantic nationalism, the European intellectuals added new dimensions to this practice of collecting relics of traditional value and turned towards folklore as an area of public interest. With greater insights and understanding into the subject, they argued that the age-old customs, traditions, practices, and arts of the so-called illiterate peasants were the actual remnants from a remote human past, having great value. Therefore, they believed that these materials should be collected and preserved before they disappear forever with the advancement of civilization and society. Many intellectuals went a few steps further and noticed a reflection of the true spirit of the nation in the traditions of these anonymous folk people who lived close to their national soil. 1.2.2 Emergence of interest in folklore. It is an acknowledged fact that serious interest in folklore was triggered in Europe due to the rise of Romantic nationalism in the early 19th century. Originally, the concept was limited to tradition, ancient customs and surviving festivals, old Ditties, dateless ballads, archaic myths, legends and fables, timeless songs and tales, adages, and proverbs. Due to its direct link with old rural elements, folklore was attributed to a feature called rurality, which primarily believed that they rural societies were the actual preservers of traditional life and cultural practices. Baumann, 1971. With new enthusiasm, intellectuals, amateurs, and artists of 19th century Europe started collecting different kinds of folklore materials to preserve, showcase, study and reflect upon the various aspects of the so-called folk life of peasant societies. During this period, many intellectuals viewed the common people as having the law, i.e., the materials, of the folk, i.e., the people who use these materials. In most cases, the folk was identified as a peasant society or rural groups or subalterns who were regarded as the main carriers of distinct traditions that were slowly dying out due to urbanization and industrialization. Especially in Europe, many intellectuals, in their individual or collective capacities, made efforts for collecting, compiling, and preserving different resources and materials of folk life and folk culture with a desire to utilize the same to reflect on the bygone days of the past. In some European countries, the emergence of interest in folklore studies was also motivated by the 18th century Enlightenment. The purview of this interest made the intellectuals regard peasants and their traditions as examples of primitive life having unique features. Going further from this point, they felt a need to study folklores to be enlightened and transformed. In most cases, the folklorists of this period primarily focused on the oral narratives, e.g., ballads, folktales, epics, sagas, etc., and the methods of transmission and sharing within and across rural communities. Accordingly, the efforts of the European intellectuals, who looked at folklore from different perspectives and purposes, played a critical role in the spread of interest in folklore studies beyond the closed corridors of a few intellectuals into a much larger arena of the general populace. 1.2.3 Founding of the discipline of folklore. From the early part of the 19th century, common people along with intellectuals were fascinated with different types and genres of folklore. Scholars from different disciplines, e.g., literature, philology, religion, psychology, history, archaeology, sociology, linguistics, anthropology, and others to name a few, came to explore the materials and contents of folklore with their divergent interests. As a result, in some countries, separate societies were formed to study folklore more intensively and critically. For instance, the British Folklore Society was founded in 1878 in the United Kingdom, and the American Folklore Society was established in 1888 in the United States of America. Also, many such societies were formed in other countries of Europe, the main goals of which were to collect and analyze folktales from varied perspectives that would serve to satisfy their curiosities for the content and philosophy they much required for their respective disciplines that were camouflaged within these materials. In Northern, Central, and Eastern Europe, the idea of folklore was directly linked to the desire for nation formation. It hence took a strong nationalist characteristic. In Finland, which was in the process of freeing itself from the domination of Sweden and Russia, folklore was used as proof of them having a separate ethnic identity. Elias Lönnrot compiled the Kalevala epic from songs that were sung in the oral tradition in Finland. Published in 1835, the Kalevala epic became the first example of literature written in Finnish and became a strong symbol of national ethnic identity. In addition, the songs were utilized to form the core of a national folklore archive, and the first professorship in folklore was established. The chair in Finnish and comparative folklore at the University of Helsinki, Finland, in 1898 was also created. Following this, within a few years, many such university departments were formed in many countries in Europe, East Asia, South America, and North America, with the conjunction of funding for establishing national museums and archives. These departments and centers assumed different designations, e.g., folklore, Volkskunde, Laographia, folk memory research, folklife research, or ethnology, to emphasize on different empirical traditions and practices of the rural peasants. Although there were variations in the political and cultural histories and national styles among folklore materials, the field of study, as well as the establishment of the academic institutions, were formed out of a sameness of spirit of nation building and recognition of indigenous cultures. However, despite this, starting from the time of its birth, folklore has continued to struggle for its identity as a separate discipline, namely, folkloristics, in the academic world. It will take several decades to achieve its autonomous academic identity and intellectual status. Even today, many countries do not have a separate academic institution of folklore, and because of this, folklore is being studied as a sub-area of some already established disciplines, e.g., anthropology, ethnology, literature, linguistics, cultural studies, or history, or outside the arena of formal academic institutions. In India, for example, there is no national society for folklore studies, like that of Finland, the UK, Germany, or the USA. There are only a few university departments that are partly or fully devoted to folkloristics. The present socio-cultural fabric of the present Indian society's needs, without any exception, a national folklore society that will serve, in conjunction with university departments, autonomous institutes, and non-governmental organizations, go for preservation, protection, and promotion of Indian folkloric traditions and heritages, both of advanced and indigenous societies. A collective collaborative initiative with the participation of various stakeholders is a primary prerequisite for the sustainable development of Indian societies. This is needed, further, with a balanced conglomeration of data and knowledge retrieved from folkloric resources. When folkloristics emerged as an academic discipline in the West, it primarily worked for the purpose of documenting Western folklore. Documentation of folklore from other parts of the world was done occasionally by a few missionaries, travelers, and anthropologists. Primarily, they used to collect a few samples of oral texts through on-site fieldwork, participant observations, and on-the-spot interviews. On some occasions, to augment their folklore databases, some secondary means as sources of folkloric materials, e.g. archives, diaries, autobiographies, letters, photographs, etc., was relied upon. In recent years, however, the scenario is changing quite rapidly with new studies about the importance of folkloric materials. The attention of collectors is being diverted towards the collection of folkloric materials of almost all indigenous languages and cultures across the world. We can see this happening in India too, as in the last few years, we have been observing a growing interest in folklore studies. Many Indian universities and institutes have introduced full academic courses on folklore, as well as have undertaken projects for collecting and compiling folkloric materials from the indigenous Indian speech communities for documentation, research, description, and application purposes. This is a much-needed enterprise, and the successful execution of this can help folklorists establish India as a greenfield of folklore, a land that possesses enormous varieties of folklore materials in a colorful canvas of wide cultural diversities and ethnological divergences. The recently introduced National Education Policy (NEP) of the Government of India, 2020, has also paid adequate importance to the preservation and protection of Indian cultures, languages, and folkloric resources. In this context, the divergent activities of anthropologists must be understood against the schemes carried out by folklorists. Anthropologists, in principle, tend to concentrate their study on the folklore of non-literate, tribal, oral, and indigenous peoples, whether these peoples are in their own country or in colonies located far away. Folklorists, on the other hand, tend to focus on the study of the folklore of the literate or non-literate subaltern people in their own countries. Such apparent differences have led some scholars to argue that folklore grew out of nationalism while anthropology grew out of colonialism. Klein, 2015. In the present frame of folkloristics, however, such differences in activities of folklorists and anthropologists are gradually diminishing, as recent studies show that folklorists are not only studying the cultural history and heritage of subaltern people but also studying the folkloric materials of tribal and indigenous societies with an equal amount of attention, interest, and integrity. 1.2.4 Birth of schools. The ideas that have been used to explain and interpret the concept of folklore coincide incidentally with some of the schools of thought used in anthropology. Macmillan, 1964. Similar to anthropology, folkloristics has categorically focused on the question of the origin and spread of ancient and widely circulated tales and other traditions of different speech communities. To address these questions, some earlier scholars have postulated the following schools of thought. Indianist school. This school of thought was formulated by Theodore Benfey, 1809 to 1881. It established that all European folktales had originated in India and spread from there to Europe and other parts of the world. Mythological school. This school of thought was propagated by Max Muller, 1823 to 1900. It argued that all folktales were survivals of ancient nature myths. Ritualist school. This school of thought was pioneered by Pierre Saint-Yves, 1870 to 1935. It demonstrates that all folktales have originated in rituals of ancient cultures. The innumerable research on folklore materials that we have come across in the last 100 years clearly indicates the vastness of folkloristics, and its study has several features and is totally multidimensional. The avenues of investigation that put the whole discipline within a narrow stretch of a school is simply an act of degeneration to the scope of such a vibrant discipline. Folkloristics today, emerging as an academic discipline, absorbs and showcases many more thoughts and ideas that these schools of thought have not been able to visualize and perceive. 1.2.5 Methods in folklore studies. In the last 200 years, we have observed the application of many methods in the studies of folklores. Burns, 1977. Starting with the theories of evolutionism and diffusionism, it has moved towards functionalism, structuralism, and other tendencies. Dundes, 1965. Some of the early methods that were applied to understand the nature, identity, and significance of folklore in life and society may be summarized in the following ways. 1. The diffusionist historical geographical method was developed by Finnish scholars at the end of the 19th century. In this hypothesis, all recorded versions and variants of a tale type, or a ballad or a riddle, were studied so that the location of the earliest traits, and theoretically also the tale's place of origin, could be determined. In this way, the gathering of comparative evidence resulted in the preparation of massive indexes and catalogues that are still consulted in comparative folklore studies. Arne and Thompson, 1961. 2. The psychoanalysis method was the result of an intellectual movement in understanding the impact of folklore on human cognition. Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, Carl Jung, 1875 to 1961, Otto Rank, 1884 to 1939, and others regarded folklore as essential expressions of individuals or collective human unconscious mind. For them, folklore was a socially sanctioned fantasy that permitted some actions that were otherwise not approved by society. 3. The local context method believed that the various forms of folklore were not only widely spread but also were firmly localized, and therefore must be studied with proper reference to their immediate social contexts. Franz Boas, 1858 to 1942, for instance, made an influential format for the study of folklore in local contexts. 4. The functionalist method of Bronisław Malinowski, 1884 to 1942, also created a lasting impact on the study of folklore by analyzing storytelling traditions among aboriginals. The main argument was that folklore has some societal functions to play in shaping the identity and the course of action for the sustenance and growth of the indigenous social cultures, practices, and traditions. 5. The structuralist method created a space among the researchers of folklore. One approach relied heavily on Russian formalism and emphasized the feature of plot sequence noted in folk narratives. The other approach derived from the works of Claude Lévi-Strauss, 1908 to 2009, and pointed to the ways in which logical relationships within myths and tales reflected the universal processes of the human mind. 1.2.6 The paradigm shift. In the 20th century, folklorists began to record folklore without any overt political motivation. They not only devised standards of identification but also classified every single example collected based on time and place to determine the original forms as well as their patterns of distribution across different geocultural settings. Gradually, with emphasis on performance analysis, they regarded each individual form as an event that emerged from interactions between the performers and the audience, and which fulfilled a particular role or function in the target social group. Baumann, 1975. Thus, the study of folklore became a vibrant area in an academic investigation, yet the discipline did not grow beyond pure research to emerge as a movement that could incorporate application and problem-solving activities as one of its aims. The first paradigm shift took place in the early 1940s. In 1939, Benjamin A. Botkin and Alan Lomax coined the phrase, applied folklore, to bring home the idea of using folklore and traditional cultural materials to address or solve real social problems. This approach emerged from Botkin's work on the collection of oral narratives of former American slaves. He showed that The dissemination of these materials has the potential to improve race relations in the United States and can combat prejudice. His landmark work, Botkin, 1945, lay my burden down, for the first time in history, considered and treated oral testimonies as historical evidence. Moreover, he developed folklore-based public programs to improve race and ethnic relations by incorporating cultural practices and materials into neighborhood events, such as community festivals, collective celebrations, and social parties. During the 1960s, the second paradigm shift occurred in theory and methods of folklore study. Folklorists became aware of the fact that strains of class, gender, and national bias were embedded in the old concept of folklore. Moreover, contrary to earlier research trends that approached folklore as authentic and a historical artifact, the new research streams pointed out that folklore is always and inevitably situated within some space and time. The studies of new researchers viewed folklore as a process-centered, context-sensitive and performance-oriented aspect of life. According to this approach, the term folk can refer to any group of people who share some common grounds, such as occupation, language, religion, or ethnicity, not geoclimatic proximity alone. People of a society are not members of some isolated single groups but are members of several folk groups. This paradigm shift allowed an expansion of the scope of folklore studies into new areas of inquiry that received little attention before. Folklorists began to apply the knowledge gained from folkloric sources to address social issues, most notably drawing on folk medicine in the teaching and practice of holistic and cross-cultural approaches to medicine and public health. They also began to contribute as consultants in city planning, gerontology, economic development, multicultural education, nature conservation, and other fields. A new diversion of applied folklore was noticed in the early 1970s when the concept of public folklore emerged. Barron and Spitzer, 1992. The supporters of this method started working for documentation, preservation, and presentation of traditional forms of folk arts, craft, folk music, and other genres of traditional folk life on larger public platforms. The main activities included the following: organizing folk arts in schools programs to present master traditional artists to primary and secondary schools in demonstrations and residences, developing apprenticeship programs to foster the teaching of traditional arts and crafts by recognized masters, presenting traditional music on international, national, regional, and local radio programs, producing documentary films on various aspects of traditional life, living styles, arts, and crafts, sponsoring performance artists who sing, dance and dramatically present oral folklore to schools and communities. The public folklorists were also actively involved in economic and community development projects. They occupied a unique position in integrating older traditions into modern life as well as continuing to collect previously lost genres of folklore for restoration and revival. In the last 4 decades, folkloristics has evolved in many dimensions. As an academic discipline, it has included traditionally derived and orally transmitted literature, material culture, arts and crafts, customs, and practices that are inseparable ingredients of the literate and technologically advanced societies as well as of the non-literate and technologically less advanced societies. Thus, the discipline is becoming more and more active and vibrant with the introduction of modern technology, e.g., digital ethnography, while other disciplines, e.g., ethnology, ecology, and anthropology, are trying to lend their material into this area with their more specified and oriented investigations. We are yet to visualize how folkloristics will reform itself as a discipline of intellectual inquiry when there are new possibilities of its cohabitation with digital humanities in the global village, as the traits of distinction between local and relic societies are rapidly vanishing. 1.3 Devolution of Folklore. The discussion presented in the previous section shows that the discipline of folkloristics has recorded a moderate growth rate. This is due to the presence of many incorrect concepts and biases that hindered the progress of folklore theories and folkloristics as a separate discipline of academic interest. Many scholars still believe that the golden age of folklore occurred centuries ago. For them, it is therefore logically necessary and desirable to engage in historically reconstructing and restructuring the golden age. This quest for the archetype is still prevalent among many conservative folklorists across the world. This implies that the directional growth of folklore studies has often been controlled by many such hypothetical theoretical premises which have not yet been examined and attested. There is a need, hence, to critically investigate these premises to check if any Significant change in methods of folklore analysis over the centuries has occurred. This will give us the scope needed to examine the examples of degeneration, decay, or devolution, which abound in traditional folklore theories, as well as acquire a conceptual clarity to understand why such biases have been generated over the centuries despite the progress of folklore theories. 1.3.1 The notion of folklore devolution. The most common notions of the devolution of folklore, given the background of the history of folklore theories, are the following. 1. Folklore decays through time, and 2. Folklore runs down by moving from higher to lower strata of society. Are these two notions mutually exclusive? Is it wrong to imagine a situation where folklore is moving from a higher to lower strata of a society and, at the same time, it is undergoing the process of gradual textual deterioration? As an example of the first notion, we may refer to the concept of disease of language as expounded by Max Muller, 1985, 12. According to this theory of semantic devolution, the original names of the Vedic and other gods have become confused or forgotten with the passing of time. The second notion is related to the theory of Gesunkinskulturgut, proposed by Hans Naumann. He argued that the upper classes invent cultural assets and gradually, at different times, these assets are taken over by the non-innovative lower classes of society. The supporters of this theory believed that folktales moved from the culturally higher to the culturally lower class of peoples, and the original forms of tales must have been the fullest and the most complete versions, which have been diluted and deteriorated in the hands of culturally lowered peoples. They also believed that the later versions of folktales were just the fragments of the fullest and original versions, and these fragmentary versions did not demonstrate the uniform patterns as noted in the fullest versions. Such ideas were, however, strongly criticized and refuted by folklorists during the later years. Dundes, 1969, Montagnol, 1996. They presented many counterexamples to break the false notion of downgradation and polarity between the high and the folk culture, as well as cited instances to show that the so-called rural peasants contributed richly to the cultural achievement even if they are not exposed to the so-called high cultural and educational values. 1.3.2 The devolutionary premises. Like the devolutionary notion, there are many examples of the devolutionary premise in theories of folklore transmission that are seen across time and space. The Grimm brothers, for instance, argued that folktales were the debris of myths. For them, folktales were broken down myths, ballads were detritus of epics or romances. Singing a folk song was a destructive act endangering the stability of the song. Telling folktales was an act of ruining them, and retelling a tale is a process of allowing forgetfulness of a raconteur to become a factor in folklore transmission. The feature of stability of folktales cannot be attributed to the memories of raconteurs, because the raconteurs might have heard the tales on many different occasions, from many different sources, as well as might have mixed up their own imagination into the original versions of tales. The central narratives of tales might have been corrected and modified by themselves on several occasions. A critical correlative of the devolutionary premise is the assumption that the oldest and the original version of an item of folklore was the best, the fullest, and the most complete one. Any kind of change in content, structure, and treatment of an item is a deviation from originality, and it is bound to lead the genre of the folklore towards imperfection or degradation from its original state of perfection. Scholars like Geller Otute argued that retelling a tale always involves a change, and although there may be an element of creativity involved in it, in its later final stages the transmission is equivalent to deterioration, a process of degeneration. Otute, 1959, 180. He, however, has the opinion that the short, elementary genres of folklore, e.g., proverbs, jokes, riddles, adages, idioms, etc., may be able to resist the corroding effect of digressive processes, but in general, larger and lucid folklore items, e.g., tales, fables, ballads, epics, elegies, etc., are more prone to deviation and deterioration over generations due to the process of retelling and remembering. Deviations are caused by memory losses and lapses of narrators, unwelcome interpolations, and contaminations of themes. Due to these reasons, many folklorists have shown strong resentment in the change of folklore and have put up clear resistance to the study of changes in folklore. Modern folklorists, however, have started changing their approaches by way of Accepting changes as inevitable parts of folklore as well as by studying changes in texts and narratives in both cultural and extra-cultural contexts. Gaze & Schwartz, 2011, 1.3.3 Negativity in Folklore Methodology. A generally negative attitude towards changes in folklore materials is also observed. In folklore research methodology, the folklorists of the historic geographic method often tend to discard the mistakes and errors found in folklore materials to extract the pure and unadulterated original forms. In most cases, it becomes an impractical ordeal, because the very act of searching for the original forms is largely blocked by many undefinable destructions. This deteriorative process undermines the oral transmission of folk narratives. Besides, this very approach, which is based on negation by nature, has been put into question regarding its relevance in a theoretical construct of folklore research methodology. Many noted folklorists have categorically commented upon the consequences of the devolutionary premise in folklore studies. They have not only challenged the hypothesis that the original form of a folk tale is necessarily the most complete and most logical version, but they have also clearly denounced this attitude with clear views. Such negations can create a strong detrimental impact on the growth of folkloristics as an independent academic discipline. Gordon Gerold, for instance, has deplored the unfortunate tendency on the part of some scholars who believe that earlier folklore materials were likely to be better than the later ones. Gerold, 1957, 214. Even though it is accepted that the process of deterioration takes place in folklore over the course of time, it is not desirable that the new forms are kept out of the attention of folklorists and are eliminated, as the themes and contents of older forms are in the process of degeneration. 1.3.4 Impact of devolutionary ideas on folklore. Most folklorists are not seriously aware of the enormous impact devolutionary ideas have upon folklore theory and research methodology. They seem to accept the age-old idea that the world of folklore is gradually degenerating. They believe that the folklore resources are losing their impact on human life, and many folklore items are losing their place in society's cultural fabric. The whole concept is codified in the Epic Laws of Folk Narrative, Ulrich, 1965, and from that day onwards, it has been presumed by many folklore researchers that the inherent strength of folklore is weakening with time. The reason behind the lack of awareness may be that folklore is regularly associated with devolution rather than evolution. It is surprising that many folklorists across the world are committed to a devolutionary premise at a time when the ideas of evolution and progress are at the forefront of intellectual thought. The intellectual history of the idea of progress is well documented. It has come into prominence at a time when the discipline of folklore has begun to emerge with its separate identity. Progress means that the golden age is not behind us but ahead of us. The positivistic approach of the ultimate perfectibility of man and society has a considerable influence upon the course of most academic disciplines. However, the effect of the evolutionary idea of progress on the treatment of folklore materials has largely been a negative rather than a positive one. Some attempts, however, have been made by scholars to borrow the evolutionary ideas in folklore theory. George and Jones, 1995, Bronner, 2017. It has been suggested that folk materials all over the world followed a basic evolutionary general law. It is natural that the original incidents in folk tales are changed in accordance with this law at different stages of civilization. The basic reason behind this change is that a folklore item is destined to change to become fit to survive through time. The process of traditional selection tends to eliminate the cruder and coarser parts of a folklore item to preserve and refine the more artistic ones. The traditional selection process operates in such a manner that with the acceptance of the concept of evolution as a process of progress, it ensures that all aesthetically superior products are preserved while aesthetically inferior products are eliminated. Despite such positive interpretation and direct effect of evolutionary theory on folklore, the concept of progress has created a devastatingly negative effect upon folklore theory. The effort for associating folklore studies with the past continues. Despite all efforts, it has been reported that noble peasants are losing their folklore as they are marching towards more advanced ways of living. Thus, it becomes not a matter of the evolution of folklore, it becomes a matter of the evolution out of folklore. To put it succinctly, as human societies evolve, so does folklore evolve. That means the history of survival of folklore is a history of dwindling and decay. As the minds of peoples of a society change in the process of progress, Culture, old customs, traditional practices, and accepted opinions start to fade out gradually. If we agree to accept the above proposition that folklore is truly dying or dead, then it makes sense to argue that the primal courses of studies of folklorists will be on dead subjects rather than on living ones. Here we come to the ultimate logical consequence of devolution, death. Therefore, devolutionary minded folklorists have devoted themselves to the act of defining the dead materials. The view still percolates among many scholars that there will be less and less folklore left until a day comes when it will disappear altogether from societies. It signifies those modern folklorists are destined to study only the disappearing, the dying, and the dead. Dundes, 1969, 17, 1.3.5. The misguided and narrow concept of folk. These negative reports of the death of folklore is a result of the misguided and narrow concept of folk. Foremost among the common mass as well as researchers, folk is conceptualized as an orientation or occupation of the peasant, an isolated rural community living generation after generation within set traditional cultural systems and practices for centuries. This way most folklorists delimit the concept of folk, thus making it easy for them to believe that folklore materials are dying out gradually. With the devolutionary demise of folk culture, the deterioration of folklore is a matter of natural course. This was visualized by Otute, 1959, 201, when he observed that if the oral tradition of peasantry continued to exist as a uniform system, the digressive and deteriorative processes play a secondary role in the dialectics of oral transmission of folk narratives. The advent of industrialization was one of the reasons that broke up the peasant culture. While capitalism was blamed for destroying folk culture and consequently for destroying folklore, however, some scholars have argued that if folklorists could have been able to free themselves from such narrow and obsolescent concepts of the folk or common, they can easily identify that there are numerous folk groups, e.g., ethnic, religious, occupational, etc., who are actively functioning with the vibe and verve of folk narratives, and that so-called peasant community is just one of many different types of folk that are present in societies from time immemorial. Dundes, 1963, 14. In fact, there are many new and heterogeneous folk groups emerging as well as new types of folklore, some of which are caused by capitalism and modernization, as in the creation of folklore from commercial advertisements. Dundes, 2005. This pejorative connotation of the word folklore has a close connection with the devolutionary premise also. If folklore is conceived to be synonymous with lack of education, then on those grounds it is good that folklore is eradicated from society. For example, with this kind of falsified reasoning, educators and social reformers like to stamp out superstitions for encouraging folk medical practices on the grounds that such practices are either harmful in and of themselves, or harmful to the extent that they delay or discourage consultation with practitioners of scientific medicine. If this argument is accepted, then it is not just that folklore is dying out, but rather it is a good thing that folklore is dying out. Unfortunately, again, the education versus folklore dichotomy is related to the devolutionary premise of folklore. In essence, the main idea is that if the peasant societies are provided with more education, especially more literacy, there will be less illiteracy, and because of this there will be fewer numbers and varieties in the genres of folklore. This is a highly falsified proposition, as there is a serious flaw in this dichotomy. We must understand that it is not true that literate or educated societies do not have folklore. Moreover, there is no evidence in support of the belief that when non-literate and illiterate peoples are literate, they tend to lose their folklore. It is a fanciful hypothesis that needs to be critically examined to see whether increased literacy and education have seriously affected the quality and quantity of folk elements in spontaneous speech events of members of societies. Also, there is no validity to the claim that the post-literate societies, as opposed to pre-literate or non-literate societies, have lost much of their folklore properties from their day-to-day life and living. Empirically, rather a contradictory phenomenon is observed. The fact that a major load of information is communicated through the mass media like radios, televisions, and movies clearly indicates that societies, in many situations, depend heavily upon oral mediums rather than relying upon writing and printing systems. It becomes obvious to understand that literacy has no role to play in the eradication of folk narratives. We can find heavy use of oral traditions in advanced and civilized societies as well as in less advanced and less civilized societies. In each society, the presence of traditional cultural elements in verbal communication of the members of a society is instrumental in shaping the operational framework of ethnographies of communication. Himes, 1972, 1.3.6 Significance of devolutionary premise in folklore theory. While we evaluate the significance of identifying a devolutionary premise in folklore theory, we also find some advantages of this theory that redirect us to look at the discipline with new perspectives and possibilities. These possibilities plant seeds for new understandings about the age-old social phenomenon and help us re-evaluate the role of folklore in shaping new knowledge-based societies. 1. Folklore, with all its branches, domains and subdomains, is in fact going through a process of metamorphosis, and that the various opinions and expressions about the devolutionary premise simply attest to this phenomenon. 2. The devolutionary premise of folklore is a culture-bound product of a 19th century worldview with the least pragmatic authenticity. It was especially favored by the supporters of Romanticism and Primitivism who encouraged scholars in many disciplines to look backwards and work with the past, which was presumed to be better, perfect, and original. 3. The believers of the devolutionary premise fabricated a cyclic scheme in which it was assumed that all folklore materials could rise like a phoenix after a period of degeneration and decay. This leads to the construction of a model in which folklore improves rather than evolves in time. It also recognizes the fact that change is not always negative. It is neutral, it is neither good nor bad. It may be either, it may be both. Dundes, 1969, 19. The approaches to folklore adopted in anthroposophical tradition and applied analytical psychology are quite beneficial for folkloristics. In these two domains, folklore is represented as an important vehicle by means of which individuals can travel back to the past through time to gain vital spiritual benefits. We can get back to nature by regaining contact with folklife and folklore. Fairy tales and myths, for instance, belong to a time immemorial when people had supernatural powers to access a spiritual reality. In modern times, people are so engaged in intellectual pursuits that they have been out of touch with spiritual reality. By reading and understanding fairy tales and mythological stories, modern people can try to rediscover their lost spiritual heritage. Fallen from grace and tainted by civilization, people need to find solace for their injured souls by immersing themselves in myths and tales which are presumed to offer a possibility of spiritual regeneration. In this sense, folklore provides a unique source of therapy for the troubled mind of the modern man. 1.4 Summary. The concept of one item of folklore with multiple variants does not need to dwell in the idea that the first creation is the most perfect one and the multiple variants, which follow the first, are merely imperfect derivatives. The whole idea of one creation giving rise to multiple variants is an intellectual concept of 18th and 19th century Europe. Ben Amos, 1971. The many variants that are derived from the first are not imperfect versions but are attested deviations that are bound to happen in a living culture, and which reflects on the truth of life that change is inevitable in every human society and civilization, and that folkloric materials are not exceptions to this universal truth. With a more eclectic theoretical framework, we might say that folklore, in general, is not devolving or dying out. Only some genres or some examples of some genres, e.g., riddles or ballads, are decreasing in popularity or usage in a society or other. In the same vein, we may say that folklore, in general, is not evolving or being born, only that some genres or some examples of some genres are increasing in popularity or usage. Also, due to many unprecedented diversions of human existence, some new forms of folklore are occasionally created to fulfill the needs of the time. We need not, therefore, place the golden age of folklore either in the far distant past or in the far distant future. We may simply indicate that folklore is a universal phenomenon both of its synchronic and diachronic axis. There has always been folklore in all human societies, and, likely, there will always be folklore in years to come. If human societies exist, if social culture vibrates, and if members of societies verbally interact with each other, and in the course of doing so, they employ traditional forms of communication, folklorists will continue to have golden opportunities to study folklore from all perspectives, with all purposes. In the new millennium, with the emergence of digital humanities, digital ethnography, and language technology, folklore studies have paved new avenues for their applications in digitization, research, and pedagogy. Noise, 2012. Due to such an unprecedented expansion of scope and utility of folklore, the modern folklorists have been able to create space for themselves in close as well as remotely linked co-fields like musicology, archiving, historical studies, culture studies, ecology, gender studies, rural sociology, community development, agriculture, ethno-medicine, mythology, and translation. Jones, 1994. Keeping aside the false notions of dying folk traditions and cultures, the new generation of folklorists and folklore researchers need to equip themselves to take up uphill challenges regarding collection, categorization, documentation, annotation, analysis, and dissemination of folk materials through various platforms for global access and utilization. It is time for them to look at folklore materials as a system of indigenous knowledge that carries immense functional relevance in reflecting on and shaping up the ethnographic profiles specific to communities across different periods in time. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video with the next chapter.